There's a sound a compound locomotive makes before the crossover pipe fails. Not the exhaust, not the whistle. Something underneath both of those, a low frequency shift in the steam note that experienced men learned to separate from the mechanical thunder of 16 drivers hammering iron rail. The men who survived described it exactly once, but the ones who heard it twice did not live to describe it a third time. If you're new to steel and sweat, this channel covers the machines and the men of American industrial history, the things that built the country, and what those things cost. Subscribe and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. This is the story of the Mallet articulated compound locomotive and the crossover pipe that concentrated every failure risk in the compound system into a single fitting that had to flex on every curve. The machine moved Appalachian coal across mountain grades no other locomotive could climb. The men in the cab sat 3 feet from a boiler that railroad engineers documented as capable, under specific failure conditions, of converting into kinetic energy equivalent to approximately 1,200 pounds of TNT. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen kept accident records that told a different story than railroad company reports. The Brotherhood had kept its own death count since 1873, because the railroads were not keeping one that the men's families could use. Between 1890 and 1917, American railroad workers died at a rate of approximately 9 per thousand annually. That rate was higher than coal mining. The mountain lines running Mallet compound locomotives at maximum output were not average. The Brotherhood knew what those numbers meant for any individual man on any individual shift. They were counting the dead long before any federal agency was, and what they were counting was the predictable cost of running machines at the outer limit of what steel, steam pressure, and human vigilance could sustain. To understand why the Mallet was that kind of machine, you have to start with the problem it was built to solve. The Allegheny Range runs through Maryland, Pennsylvania, and deep into West Virginia. In the 1890s, it was strangling American freight railroads. Grades of 2% and 3% on the worst stretches, curves so tight that a long locomotive would bind against the rails before reaching the crest. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had thrown everything at those grades. Bigger locomotives, helper engines, double crews, none of it was sufficient. A fully loaded coal train on a 2% Allegheny grade could stop the best conventional locomotive the Baltimore and Ohio owned cold. The coal that heated American cities and fired American steel mills sat in the hills of West Virginia. Getting it out meant loading it on trains. Getting those trains over the mountains required a locomotive powerful enough to pull them. In the 1890s, that locomotive did not exist. There was a man in Paris who had understood the solution for 20 years. Anatole Mallet was a Swiss engineer who had patented a compound steam system in 1874. In a conventional locomotive, steam from the boiler enters the cylinders once, drives the pistons, and exhausts to atmosphere. In Mallet's compound system, steam enters a set of high-pressure cylinders first, does its initial work, then exhausts not to the stack, but forward into a second set of cylinders at lower pressure, expanding further and extracting more work from the same fuel and water before finally releasing. He added articulation in 1884, 2 complete steam engines mounted under one boiler, with the front engine free to pivot on a hinge so the whole machine could flex through mountain curves without derailing. 2 engines, twice the driving wheels, twice the pulling force. The compound thermodynamics in the articulated frame solved both the power problem and the curve problem simultaneously. Mallet pitched the design to every major railroad in Europe and America for nearly 2 decades. The railroads called it overcomplicated, unstable, too many moving parts. But in 1904, the Baltimore and Ohio placed an order with the American Locomotive Company for one prototype, road number 2,400, 334,500 pounds, 12 driving wheels, tractive effort of 71,500 pounds, nearly twice what the best conventional locomotive on the Baltimore and Ohio could produce. The crews took one look at it and named it Old Maud, after a cartoon mule. Slow, stubborn, and strong enough to move the earth. They were correct on all 3 counts. Old Mod topped out at 21 miles per hour, but speed was never the point. The point was the mountain that had been defeating every locomotive the Baltimore and Ohio owned for 50 years. On that mountain, with a full load, Old Mod kept pulling through every grade and curve that had previously stranded trains. The loads it moved in a single trip had required 2 locomotives and 2 full crews. One Mallet replaced both. The railroad men stopped laughing. Within a year, Baldwin Locomotive Works was building their own Mallets. Within a decade, every major mountain freight railroad in America was ordering them. The design grew with each successive order. Bigger boilers, more driving wheels, more power, and each generation more pressurized, more thermally stressed, and more capable of catastrophic failure than the one before. More power. By 1910, the Virginian Railway was running Mallet compounds over the West Virginia coal grades, producing 147,200 pounds of tractive effort from a boiler running at 215 pounds per square inch, the highest sustained pressure in regular American railroad service at the time. By the 1930s, Norfolk and Western Y-class Mallets had pushed that envelope further. The final version, the Norfolk and Western Y6B, weighed 582,900 pounds for the locomotive alone. Load the tender with 30 tons of coal and 20,000 gallons of water, and you were moving over 500,000 kilograms down a mountain track. It ran at 300 pounds per square inch. It produced 170,000 pounds of tractive force, a number that has never been matched by any steam locomotive before or since. 2 men operated it, in a cab the size of a small room. To understand what made that machine dangerous in a specific and documented way, you have to follow the compound steam path, and the one point in that path where every failure risk concentrated. Steam entered the rear high-pressure engine at full boiler pressure, whatever that number was on a given day. On the Y6B, 300 pounds per square inch. Those cylinders drove the rear 8 driving wheels. The exhaust steam, spent but still carrying pressure, then had to travel forward to the front low-pressure engine. That transit required crossing the hinge point between the 2 engine units, the articulated joint where the front engine pivoted to track curves. The crossover pipe that carried the steam through that joint was sealed by metal-to-metal contact and packing material. On a stationary machine in a maintenance shop, the seal held without difficulty. On a machine flexing through mountain curves under full load, that joint moved constantly. The packing compressed, the metal contacts wore, and the seal began to leak. A fine hiss of steam at first, widening as the packing degraded. The maintenance crews knew it. They repacked the joints on schedule. But hard mountain service between scheduled maintenance was not a controlled environment, and on a machine running Allegheny grades at maximum output for hours at a stretch, the difference between a joint in specification and a joint beginning to fail was not always visible from outside the cab. When the crossover pipe failed fully under load, the consequences cascaded in sequence. The steam that had been driving the front engine stopped driving it. The front engine lost power while the rear engine continued pulling. On level track at low speed, a lurch. On a mountain grade with 10,000 tons of loaded coal hoppers pressing forward from behind, that lurch was something the engineer felt in the brake handle before he understood what had caused it. If the failure was a rupture rather than a seal leak, the steam releasing into the cab space between the 2 engines was at intermediate pressure, hot enough to scald skin and blind eyes faster than a man could move away from it. The crossover pipe was not located in a position where the cab crew was directly exposed to it, but on a machine operating in a confined mountain canyon, there was nowhere for that release to go that was not, in some way, toward the men who were running the machine. How does a man sit 3 feet from a boiler at 300 pounds per square inch for 4 hours on a mountain grade and maintain the vigilance that the machine requires? How does he read a water glass, manage a mechanical stoker, call the grades, watch the pressure gauges, and listen for the low frequency shift in the steam note that means the pipe joint below him is beginning to give way, all at once, in a cab where the noise is total and the vibration makes every gauge needle a moving target? Leave a comment below. But the answer is that the men who ran these machines developed a specific kind of attention that came from years of running them and from the knowledge of what they were sitting next to. The fireman's job on a late production Y-class Mallet was not the same as shoveling coal. By the 1930s, a mechanical stoker, a steam-driven screw conveyor, fed crushed coal into the firebox at rates exceeding 5,000 pounds per hour. No human shoveler could have kept pace with what the boiler demanded at full output. The fireman managed the stoker, adjusted coal distribution across the grate with steam jets, watched the combustion, and watched the water glass. That glass was a narrow tube mounted on the boiler backhead, the wall of the boiler facing into the cab. It showed the water level inside the pressure vessel. As long as the level was where it was supposed to be, the machine was operating within its design. If it dropped, the fireman had minutes, not hours, to restore it before the physics became irreversible. But here is the detail that the Brotherhood accident files return to again and again. The water glass could lie. A deposit of mineral scale, the product of evaporating hard water, could accumulate in the connection between the sight glass and the boiler interior. A clogged connection would show the fireman a reading of the trapped water column rather than the actual boiler level. The glass would read full while the boiler ran dry underneath it. Standard procedure required the fireman to blow down the gauge hourly, opening a valve to flush the connection with live steam and verify that the reading was reflecting actual boiler water rather than trapped scale. When that procedure was followed consistently, the risk of a false reading was managed. When it lapsed, when the run was hard and the grade was long and the fireman's attention was on the stoker, which was jamming again, the gauge read what the scale wanted it to read until the moment it could not anymore. What happened when the boiler ran too low was not complicated. The crown sheet, the steel plate at the top of the firebox, required water coverage from above to stay within temperature limits. Fire attacked it from below at all times. Water above it absorbed the heat, dropped the water level below that plate, and the fire kept burning against steel that had nothing to absorb the heat being applied to it. The steel temperature climbed fast. The stay bolts holding the crown sheet in place began to crack under the thermal stress. The crown sheet began to distort. When it failed, the remaining boiler water contacted superheated metal and vaporized in a fraction of a second. 300 pounds per square inch of stored pressure converted to kinetic energy instantaneously. The boiler, tens of thousands of pounds of steel, left the frame. It has been recovered hundreds of feet from the point of failure in fields, through buildings. The cab, the engineer, the fireman were gone before any of them could have processed what was happening. The old railroad men who described running these machines professionally used words like vigilance and responsibility, but what they were describing, stripped of the professional register, was a specific and sustained controlled fear that never went away because it was not supposed to go away. The fear was the operational requirement. The fear was what kept a man watching a sight glass, blowing it down every hour and listening for a subtle shift in the steam note beneath the mechanical noise of the cylinders, the stoker, and the drivers. Experienced firemen developed an instinct for their specific machine that went past training into something harder to categorize. They could hear when the boiler's exhaust note shifted in a way that indicated a pressure drop before the gauge needle moved. They could feel when the stoker rhythm changed in a way that meant the coal flow was inconsistent. After thousands of hours next to something permanently capable of killing them, they either developed that sensitivity or they did not last long enough to develop anything. If this history matters to you, go ahead and hit subscribe right now and leave a comment below with the next story you want to see. But the Brotherhood's accident files show what happened when the machine took what it was owed, and the pattern in those files is not random. It follows the same fault sequence every time. Low water, crown sheet, failure, each event documented separately, each one an isolated investigation, an isolated report, an isolated conclusion. The pattern was visible in aggregate only to the men who were keeping their own count. Between 1890 and 1917, American railroad workers died at that rate, 9 per thousand. The mountain lines were not the average, they were the high end. The men whose funerals were held by the B&O, the N and W, and the Chesapeake and Ohio during those years were not killed by freak accidents. They were killed by operating a machine at its design limits in an environment that provided no margin when the limits were exceeded. The Brotherhood knew this. They said it in their proceedings and their safety publications. They advocated for inspection regimens and gauge testing protocols and cab protection standards. The railroads acknowledged the recommendations, filed the proceedings, and continued running the machines at the outputs the coal contracts required. Specific events produced specific Interstate Commerce Commission investigation reports. Specific men provided the data for those reports. On May 12, 1948, near Chillicothe, Ohio, a Chesapeake and Ohio T1 heavy freight locomotive, working upgrade at full tonnage, suffered a crown sheet failure. The engineer, the fireman, and the brakeman were all killed by scalding steam. Investigators found the cause immediately. Low water. The crew had been pushing hard to crest the grade. The water dropped. The metal failed. On the Delaware and Hudson, earlier in that decade, a Mallet-type locomotive on the Richmondville grade had its boiler blown clear of the frame, traveling nearly 300 feet before impact. Investigators filed the report. The railroad absorbed the finding. A replacement locomotive was assigned to the same grade. The run continued on schedule. 2 accidents, 2 railroads, 1 cause, both documented, both investigated, both filed. On June 9, 1953, at 1:20 in the afternoon, Chesapeake and Ohio Locomotive 1642 departed Handley, West Virginia, eastbound with 123 loaded coal hoppers. Adjusted tonnage was 7,510 tons. The engineer was Wilbur H. Anderson of Hinton, a man who knew this railroad and had run these machines for years. The fireman was JW Sullivan. The head brakeman was O Richmond. 3 men who had worked this grade before, experienced and professional, running a machine they understood. The first 4 hours were unremarkable. A water and coal stop at Thurmond, 38 miles out. Another water stop at Quinnamont, 12 miles further, where additional cars were added to the train. The locomotive was working, the gauges were reading, the train was moving. But what nobody in that cab knew, what would only become clear after the fact in the ICC investigation record, was that previous crews had reported a faulty water level gauge on Locomotive 1642. The complaint had been logged, the locomotive had been inspected and returned to service. The gauge that may have been showing the crew water that was not there had passed that inspection. At 5:25 in the afternoon, 21 miles east of Quinnamont, Locomotive 1642 was traveling at 20 miles per hour on level track, approaching CW Cabin, a telegraph station beside the line. The operator was at his desk when a call came in asking about the train's location. He looked out the window and saw the locomotive approaching, 600 feet away. He stood up. He watched. He later told investigators that the locomotive appeared to disintegrate. Then it was obscured by steam and smoke. He reached for his phone and called the dispatcher. He said, "Locomotive 1642 has blown up. Get an ambulance." Parts of the locomotive were scattered across the surrounding countryside. An ICC investigation was complete by July 6, 1953. Report number 3520. The cause was an overheated crown sheet due to low water. Buried in the testimony was this. A witness working beside the track, approximately 1.5 miles from the explosion point, stated that as Locomotive 1642 passed him, the low water alarm whistle was sounding. The alarm that existed to tell the crew the boiler was dangerously low was already sounding as the train went by that witness. If the crew heard it and the gauge was still reading falsely, they had seconds to reconcile what the alarm was telling them against what the instrument was showing. If they had seconds, they may not have been enough. If the gauge had been reading falsely for the entire run, they may not have understood what they were hearing until it was already past the point where anything they could do would matter. Georgia Anderson, the engineer's widow, received $10,000 from the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway in compensation. $10,000 for a man who had done his job exactly as he was trained to do it, on a machine with a reported faulty gauge that had been inspected and cleared. Locomotive 1642 was not rebuilt. The class was already being retired, and it was scrapped within weeks. The 3 men were buried. And in the permanent record of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, a notation about a faulty water level gauge reported by previous crews, inspected and returned to service, became part of the archive of things that were known and not resolved before the resolution arrived on its own terms. What does it mean that a fault was reported, logged, inspected, and returned to service? What is the right word for the interval between when a gauge is reported defective and when 3 men die because the gauge read falsely? Leave a comment below. The Norfolk and Western held on longer than any other railroad in America, still running Y-class compound mallets years after every other Class I railroad had converted to diesel. In pure tractive terms, the Y6B at 170,000 pounds was still the strongest single unit ever built when the decision came. In 1958, the Norfolk and Western's new president ordered complete dieselization. In July 1959, the last Y6B was retired from mainline service. The fires went cold, the boilers were drained, the steam pressure dropped to 0 for the last time in each machine, and the thing that had shaken the ground from a mile away sat silent beside the diesel units idling next to it. Almost all of them were scrapped within 2 years. 50 Y-class locomotives, still serviceable, still capable of doing the work they had been built to do, were reduced to raw steel. What the diesels offered was not primarily superior power. What they offered was a CAE where no man sat 3 feet from the crown sheet, no water glass to watch, no sight glass to blow down every hour, no low water alarm screaming in a mountain tunnel while the crew had seconds to understand what it meant. A handful of the great articulated compounds survive in museums. N and W2156, a Y6A, is at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis. C and O1601, the same class as Locomotive 1642, is at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. You can stand next to these machines and try to take in what they were. Most people find they cannot quite do it. The driving wheels are nearly 5 feet tall. The boiler rises over your head. The cab is shockingly small for what it sat beside. A man-sized room next to a machine-sized pressure vessel, a place where experienced men watched a glass tube every hour and hoped the connection was clear. Wilbur H. Anderson is buried in Hinton, West Virginia. JW Sullivan and O Richmond are in the same record. They are in ICC report number 3520 as cause of death data. They are in the Brotherhood's annual accounts as 3 of the 9 per thousand for that year on that railroad. The crossover pipe they monitored, the water glass they watched, the gauge that previous crews had reported and that had been inspected and returned to service, all of that is in the archive. Georgia Anderson's $10,000 settlement is in the archive. The coal those machines moved is in the steel those machines made possible. It is in buildings, it is in ships, it is in 2 wars. Wars' worth of American industrial output. The machines that moved it are in scrap, in museums, and in a handful of ICC investigation files that most people will never read. The debt a machine accumulates does not appear on its maintenance record. It appears on the day it collects. The men who ran the mallets knew the debt was accumulating. They climbed in anyway, every shift, because the coal had to move and because they were not the kind of men who stopped doing a job just because it could kill them. That kind of attention to a dangerous machine, that specific controlled vigilance sustained over thousands of hours, is in the record of what those men were. It is not on the locomotive. The locomotive is scrapped. The debt a machine accumulates does not appear on its maintenance record. It appears on the day it collects. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe to Steel and Sweat and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. Thanks for watching.